Hello, my friend. Today I will tell you another long-forgotten legend. Close your eyes and let the magic transport you to Middle-earth. Our journey begins. Long ago, before the great wars that shook the world, and before even the white tree blossomed once again in Gondor, there was a small settlement upon the river Gelion. It was called Lanthier's Ford, a place few had heard of, and fewer still had ever seen. Nestled between tall, whispering reeds and broad green fields, it lay far from the great roads of kings and hero. Its people were simple folk, fishers, farmers, and stonemasons, who tended the earth with honest hands and sang songs older than memory itself. Through Lanthier's Ford ran the ancient stone bridge of Berthil, built in forgotten ages when elves still roamed freely through the world and the stars were young. It was no ordinary bridge, crafted with a magic now lost to men. Its stones bore no cracks, nor had its surface worn thin despite the endless passing of years. The people of Lanthier's Ford had long guarded it without knowing why, only that it was sacred, and that to forsake it would bring ill. Days were peaceful, and the river Gelion sang sweetly as it wound its way to the distant seas. But in the summer of that fateful year, the waters began to fall. Day by day the river grew narrower, and the land it left behind grew dark and slick with hidden mud. The old ones whispered that such a thing had not happened since the world was young. And in the shadowy hours between dusk and dawn, some claimed to hear strange sounds, scrapings and mutterings rising from the river's dry bed. Few paid heed at first, for life's labors are heavy, and folk will often turn their eyes from what they fear. But when the first sheep went missing, and when black shapes were seen moving swift as shadows among the reeds, fear took root. The village elders gathered in the longhouse at the heart of Lanthier's Ford. Their faces were lined with worry, and the fire burned low in the great hearth. "It is an ill omen," said Old Mouth and the Reeve, his voice heavy with dread. "The river is sick, and with its retreat, old evils have found a path into our lands." "But what are we to do?" cried young Selwin, whose fields lay closest to the river. "We have no soldiers, no swords worth naming. If the dark things come for us, we are but lambs before the wolf." A heavy silence fell over the room. It seemed as though all hope had fled. Yet hope, as it often does, came unlooked for. That very night, as the mist rose thick upon the river's banks and the moon hid her face, a lone rider came to Lanthier's Ford. His cloak was gray as the twilight, and a tall, pointed hat shadowed his face. Leaning upon a staff that seemed no more than a wanderer's stave, he crossed the stone bridge as though he had traveled that road 100 times before. When he entered the long house, none could speak at first, for the air seemed to hum with unseen power. His eyes, keen and bright, swept over the gathered folk, and when he smiled, it was as though the first true light of dawn had broken over a weary land. "I am Gandalf," he said simply, "and I have come because whispers of dark waters have reached even the farthest corners of the world. Tell me now, what shadows trouble your hearts?" Thus hope was rekindled in Lanthier's Ford. The elders told Gandalf all they knew, that the river had fallen, that creatures unseen crept by night, and that fear grew daily in the hearts of the people. Gandalf listened, stroking his long beard thoughtfully. At last he rose and paced before the fire, his staff tapping gently on the wood. "There is evil at work here," he said gravely. "Long has the river hidden the deep caves that lie beneath its bed. Now, with the waters fled, they are open once more, and from their darkness ancient enemies crawl forth. Orcs, I deem, and worse things beside. A murmur of terror spread. Few among the villagers had seen orcs, but tales of their cruelty were well known, passed down in fearful whispers from the elder days. "But why here?" asked Mothinen. "What do they seek in a place so small?" Gandalf's eyes gleamed. "The bridge," he said. "It is more than stone and mortar. In ancient days it was laid down by the elves of Oserond, and beneath it run old magics that even the dark lords of the world would fear to cross unchecked. If the enemy can claim it, they will have a stronghold from which to strike into the heart of Eriador." The meaning of this struck the villagers dumb. Their small, humble home had become the battleground of greater powers than they could comprehend. Teeing their fear, Gandalf spoke again, his voice now ringing with strength. "But hear me, the strength of the enemy is not yet full. If we stand fast, if we defend the bridge with all our might, we may yet prevail. Courage is our weapon, and in such hands, even the smallest flame can banish the deepest darkness." A stirring went through the hall, like the first warm breath of spring after a long winter. Men who had thought themselves no more than plowmen or fishermen straightened their backs. Women who had wept in fear now set their jaws with grim resolve. There, in that small hall by the river, an army was born, not of knights and lords, but of common folk who dared to hope. Gandalf wasted no time. He set the able-bodied to strengthening the bridge's defenses, piling stones, setting traps, and digging ditches. The wise women and the quick-fingered youth were set to fletching arrows and crafting slings. Even the children helped, carrying stones and water to the weary workers. For 3 days and 3 nights they labored as the dark clouds thickened on the horizon. And on the 4th night, as the stars flickered like frightened candles and the mist rolled low over the riverbed, the drums began to beat, or off at first, like the heartbeat of the world itself, slow and steady, but growing louder with ever passing hour, until the very ground seemed to tremble beneath their feet. The Orcs were coming, and the battle of the dark waters was about to begin. Night had descended upon Lanthier's ford, thick and heavy as a shroud, and the moon hung low and sickly behind veils of cloud. Along the battered edge of the stone bridge, the villagers stood ready, their hearts hammering within their chests at what weapons they had managed to fashion: spears hewn from cartwood, hunting bows strung taut with gut, and old swords brought down from mantles where they had long hung as relics of forgotten skirmishes. Gandalf moved among them like a spirit of ancient days, his gray cloak billing in the restless wind, his staff burning with a faint bluish light to guide their eyes and steel their wavering courage. The drums beyond the riverbed throbbed louder now, no longer distant, but near at hand, and with them came the sound of guttural cries, hoarse-a-row and fierce as the enemy drew into sight. First mere shadows among the reeds, slinking low and swift, and then, as the last mists parted under the rising wind, the Orcs came plainly into view. Scores upon scores of them, their twisted armor glinting blackly beneath the stars, their misshapen weapons clutched in clawed hands. They were not a great host compared to the armies of old, but against the humble folk of Lanthier's ford, they seemed as a sea of nightmare, born from the deepest pits of fear. Gandalf raised his staff high, and his voice rang out clear across the dark waters, a voice of command. "Stand fast, men of Lanthier's ford. You guard more than your homes this night. You guard the light of the free peoples against the returning shadow." At his words, a shout rose from the defenders, ragged but fierce, and it seemed to them that they were no longer simple farmers or fishermen, but the shield-bearers of a greater cause. Then with a shriek that tore the night apart, the first wave of orcs rushed forward, their iron-shod feet splashing through the shallow, blackened waters. Arrows loosed from the bridge whistled down among them, felling many before they reached the causeway. Yet more came on, heedless of death, driven by some unseen will, deeper and darker than their own. They hurled crude javelins and stones, and their archers sent black feathered shafts hissing through the air, so that the defenders must crouch low behind hastily built parapets of stone and wood. Selwin, young and fleet of foot, moved among the defenders, carrying fresh quivers of arrows and water to the thirsty bowmen. His hands bled from splinters and stone, but his face shone with fierce determination. Old Mouthen stood near the center of the bridge, his broad shoulders firm as an oak's roots, wielding a great axe that had belonged to his forefathers in the elder days. In every stroke he made cleft through shield and bone alike. Beside him fought others, men and women together, a handful against a multitude, but none gave ground, for the bridge behind them was the heart of their world, and they would see it fall only over their dead bodies. Gandalf himself stood upon the bridge-egg's highest arch, his staff ablaze with searing white flame, and wherever he turned his hand, the orcs faltered, shrieking and clawing at their faces as though struck by unseen blows. Thunder rolled in the high heavens, though no storm had broken, and the river Gelion, sluggish and thin, seemed to groan beneath the weight of the dark powers stirring within the earth. Yet for all the defenders' valor and Gandalf's mighty aid, the orcs pressed on. Wave upon wave hurled themselves against the stone bridge, heedless of loss, and at times it seemed the line must break. More than once the enemy gained the foot of the bridge itself, scrambling up the slick stones with hooked hands and tearing at the defenders with mindless rage. In those moments, battle was joined hand to hand, and the clash of steel, the cries of pain, and the roar of desperate valor filled the night. At one such dire moment, a band of orcs wielding iron grapples clambered onto the bridge's flank, seeking to pull down a portion of the wall and open the way for the horde. Gandalf, seeing the peril, strode forward through the press of men and beasts, his staff flashing in his right hand, glamoring his gleaming sword in his left, with a great cry that echoed from the riverbanks to the far-off hills. He struck the ground with his staff, and from the stone rose a white fire that scorched the grables to molten slag and sent the orcs reeling back into the dark waters, shrieking as they fell, ill they came. The night wore on, and the villagers' arms grew heavy, their quivers lighter, their strength nearly spent. Many bore wounds, some light, others grave, but none fell back, for behind them was their home, their families, and all they held dear. And above them all stood Gandalf, tireless and unbowed, a beacon of hope against the tide of despair. As the black hours deepened and the eastern sky showed no hint of dawn, Gandalf called Malfin and Selwin to him. His face was grim, and his eyes burned with a strange light. "We cannot hold thus forever," he said. "The enemy is driven by a will of malice and hatred deeper than mere orc cunning. I fear a greater shadow stirs beneath the river, a darkness that hungers for more than this bridge. What can we do?" Panted Mouth and wiping blood from his brow. "We must strike them where they are strongest," Gandalf answered. Their strength comes not from their numbers alone, but from the darkness within the caves that birthed them. If we can collapse the mouth of the caves and drive them into confusion, we may yet turn the tide." Selwyn's face palled, but he did not flinch. "Tell us what must be done," he said. And Gandalf smiled, not with joy, but with pride. "You are brave, lad," he said, "and I shall have need of that courage before this night is done." Thus, even as the battle raged on the bridge, a bold and desperate plan began to take shape. A plan to carry the fight into the enemy's lair itself, and to strike a blow that would shatter their will and save Lanthier's Ford from the darkness rising from beneath the earth. Under Gandalf's swift command, Selwyn and a chosen few, young and fleet of foot, yet steady of heart, gathered near the bridge's end, hidden behind the broken stones of the river's old. The wizard spoke quickly, his voice low yet firm, for the orc host still pressed forward with undiminished fury, and even the briefest distraction might cost dearly. They were to slip through the shadows, circle wide about the battlefield, and come upon the mouth of the river caves from behind. There, using oil-soaked wood and bundles of pitch, they would ignite a fire mighty enough to choke the very throat of the caves, collapsing their entrance and cutting off the enemy's reinforcements. It was a desperate ploy, but in such dark hours, desperate deeds were often the last hope of the free peoples of Middle-earth. The company set out at once, moving silently along the river's broken edge, the mist cloaking their passage, though the black eyes of the orcs searched restlessly for prey. Gandalf remained behind, standing tall upon the stone bridge's arch, weaving spells of light and fire to hold the enemy's gaze upon him and blind them to the peril stealing towards their lair. The battle raged on in a tumult of cries and clashing iron, but through it all the small band pressed forward, hearts pounding with fear and a fierce, burning resolve. Selwyn led them, his face set and grim beneath the starlight. He thought of his father's fields lying dark beyond the hill, of his mother's hands baking bread at the hearth, and of the songs he had sung as a boy along the riverbanks. All this he bore in his heart as a shield against the terror that sought to unman him. Close behind him came Elrich the smith's son, broad and silent, and Hara, fleet-footed and keen-eyed, along with 6 others chosen for their courage rather than their might. They moved like wraiths among the reeds, until at last they reached a low hollow where the river had once run deep, but now stood dry and fouled. There they saw it, the gaping maw of the caves, jagged and black, yawning wide beneath a cliff of broken stone. A foul stench rose from its depths, and the ground trembled faintly with the passing of unseen things below. Around its mouth lurked many orcs, grim and watchful, yet less than those who had been drawn into the main assault upon the bridge. The defenders of Lanthier's Ford were not warriors by birth, but what they lacked in arms they made up for in cunning, and they waited with patient silence, letting the enemy grow careless. With a swelling confidence of numbers at Selwyn's signal, they crept closer, setting their bundles of pitch and oil soaked among the rocks that overhung the cave's mouth. The work was slow, for the orcs milled near, and at any moment a cry might be raised to bring ruin upon them. Twice they froze, hearts hammering in their throats, as a patrol passed so close that they could smell the beast's foul breath. But fortune, or perhaps the will of higher powers, favored them, and they were not discovered. And when all was ready, Selwyn motioned to Elrich, who struck flint to steel with shaking hands. Sparks flew, caught upon the oil-soaked cloth, and with a rush, flame blossomed like a living thing, leaping up the stones and racing towards the bundles laid deep within the rocks. For a moment there was silence, and then a roar like a dragon's breath filled the night, and the earth itself seemed to lurch. The cliff above the caves shuddered and groaned, and with a thunderous crash, the mouth of the cave collapsed inward, choking the passage with boulders and flame. A great cry of dismay rose from the orcs both near and far, for they were cut off from their lair and their hidden masters. Panic spread among them like wildfire, and their ordered ranks broke into confusion. Those nearest the bridge faltered, some turning to flee, others casting down their arms and howling in despair. Seizing the moment, Gandalf raised his staff high, and from its tip a light blazed forth like a shard of the sun, dazzling. "Now!" cried Gandalf, his voice a clarion call in the darkness. "Now, brave hearts of Lanthier's Ford, strike for your homes, for your children, for all the free folk of Middle-earth." With a shout that shook the very stones of the bridge, the defenders surged forward, driving the disordered. Spears flashed and arrows flew, and a clash of sword upon shield rang out anew, fiercer than before. Molten led the charge, his great axe hewing a path through the enemy ranks, while Gandalf strode at his side, gleaming like a star fallen to earth. At the river's edge, Selwin and his band returned, battered but alive, and they too fell upon the routed enemy with cries of triumph. The tide had turned. Orcs fled in droves, their spirit broken, casting aside arms and armor as they scrambled back into the blackness of the night, where Gandalf's light could not reach. Yet even as victory neared, Gandalf's brow furrowed with deepening concern, for he felt, as only those attuned to the unseen currents of the world could feel, that the true darkness had not yet been vanquished. A deeper malice stirred beneath the river and the stones, a will that had driven the orcs to this desperate assault, and which now thwarted, gathered itself for one final blow. As the last of the orcs were driven into the mists, and silence fell upon the blood-streaked bridge, Gandalf stood still, listening with all the might of his spirit. Beneath the broken riverbed, hidden from mortal sight, something vast and ancient moved, a shadow older than the kingdoms of men, a hatred born before the first sunrise. His heart grew heavy, for he knew then that the battle of the dark waters was not yet fully won. He turned to the weary defenders, their faces lit with the first rays of a gray and troubled dawn, and spoke words that chilled the heart even amidst victory. "Ache your rest if you can, but keep your weapons near," said Gandalf. "For the enemy we have faced this night was but the herald of a greater peril yet to come." Thus ended the first battle for the stone bridge of Berthil. But in the hearts of those who survived, the knowledge grew that their courage would be tested anew before their fate was decided. Gray light filtered over the battered fields and blackened stones of Lanthier's Ford, a wan and sorrowful dawn that seemed scarcely able to pierce the gloom that yet clung to the river's banks. The defenders, worn and wounded, gathered in the shelter of the longhouse once more, their faces marked with soot, sweat, and blood. But in their eyes burned a fierce and solemn pride. Few had fallen in the night's desperate battle, though many bore wounds that would scar them forever, and all had seen sights that would haunt their dreams for many seasons to come. Yet they had stood against the shadow, and though the price had been bitter, they had not faltered. And moved among them, lending his strength where it was needed most, speaking soft words to the wounded, encouraging the weary, and binding up with ancient songs the hurts that herbs and hands alone could not heal. His presence was as a tower of hope to them, and where his shadow passed, it seemed that fear was driven back a little more. But for all his labors, the wizard's heart was heavy, for he knew well that the true storm had yet to break. Mothin, the old reeve, sat upon a stone near the hearth, his broad hands trembling as he sharpened the edge of his great axe. While Selwin and Hara, their clothing torn and stained with the night's grim work, saw to the gathering of provisions and the tending of the wounded. All eyes turned to Gandalf when at last he called them together, his voice low but firm like the rumble of a far-off thunderhead. "You have fought bravely," he said, and his words warmed their hearts, though the chill of fear still clung to them. "Your deeds shall not be forgotten, for you have stood where many greater than you might have fallen. Yet I must speak plainly, for time is not our ally. The orcs you faced last night were not led by their own counsels alone. They were driven by a darker will, one that yet abides in the depths beneath the river." The silence fell over the hall, broken only by the crackling of the meager fire upon the hearth. Outside, the mists coiled thick and low over the land, and the river, though weakened, still sang its mournful song among the reeds. "There is a creature," Gandalf continued, "one born in ages long forgotten by men. It is a servant of the darkness that once covered this world like a second skin, and though it is not great among the ancient evils, its malice is deep and its cunning keen. It sleeps beneath the waters and the stones, and it is stirred once more, seeking to reclaim what little dominion it can over this land." "But what is it, Lord?" asked Selwyn, his voice steady, though his hand clutched the hilt of his blade until the knuckles showed white. Gandalf's gaze grew distant, as if he looked far away into shadows that none but he could see. The elder tongue of the elves, it is called Gulroth, the shadow of the deep waters. It is a spirit of hunger and hate drawn to places of old power, and it feeds upon fear and despair. Long ago, the elves sealed it beneath the river with spells woven from light and song. But with the rivers failing, those bindings have weakened. It was Gulroth who called the orcs from the caves, promising them blood and plunder if they would break the stone bridge and tear down the last defenses of this land. The villagers stirred uneasily, for though few among them had dealings with such ancient lore, they could feel in their bones the weight of the words Gandalf spoke. "Then how are we to defeat such a thing?" asked Malphine, his voice roughened by fear but not broken by it. "It cannot be defeated by blade alone," Gandalf answered. "Its body is of shadow, its life woven from the dark places of the world. But there are still ways to bind it anew, to drive it back into slumber, if we have the courage and the will." He paused, and his keen eyes swept over each face in turn, reading the doubt and fear and the slow, stubborn fire of resolve that burned beneath. "I must descend into the riverbed," Gandalf said at last, "to the place where the heart of the bridge's power lies hidden. There I can weave a binding strong enough to hold Gulroth for another age of the world, if fortune favors us. But I cannot go alone, for the creature will resist with all its might, and its thralls may strike from the shadows. I will need guardians, those who will stand with me in the blackness and defend the circle of the spell while it is wrought." A deep and heavy silence followed his words, for each knew the peril that awaited beneath the earth. To face a host of orcs with spear and bow was fearsome enough, but to stand against a creature of shadow and ancient hate was a task that few would dare. Yet it was Selwyn who spoke first, stepping forward from the gathered folk, his shoulders straight and his voice clear. "I will go," he said. "If this thing seeks to drown our home in darkness, then I will face it, whether I live or die." Then Elrich, son of the smith, rose also, and Hara beside him, and many others besides, men and women alike, for though they were weary and sorely wounded, the spirit of Lanthier's Ford had been kindled into flame. They would not see their homes fall into ruin without standing to the last. A strange light came into Gandalf's eyes then, a glimmer of pride and of sorrow mingled, for he knew what price such valor might demand. Yet he nodded gravely and gave his blessing. "So be it," he said. "We march when the sun is at its highest, for light yet holds power over the shadows of the world. Prepare yourselves and hold fast to hope, for hope is the blade that pierces the darkness." Thus the defenders of Lanthier's Ford girded themselves once more for battle, not with the joy of warriors seeking glory, but with the quiet, grim courage of those who stand because there is no one else left to stand. And in the hearts of all, from the youngest to the oldest, grew the knowledge that what they faced was no longer a mere battle for their homes, but a battle for the very light of their lives. The sun, when it rose at last through the heavy clouds, was a pale and hollow thing, but it lent a frail strength to the weary and the brave. And so, under its failing light, Gandalf and his chosen companions made ready to descend into the depths where Gulroth, the shadow of the dark waters, stirred in restless. When the sun stood at its zenith, pale and veiled though it was behind tattered banners of cloud, Gandalf gathered the company upon the stone bridge. They were few, scarcely more than a dozen souls, yet each bore within their breast a heart kindled with a fire that no darkness could easily quench. There stood Selwin, his young face grim with resolve; Elrich, broad-shouldered and silent, the hammer of his father's slung across his back; Hara, light of foot and sharp of eye, and many others whose names would be sung in Lanthier's Ford for long years to come, whether they survived the day or not. They bore what arms they could, swords newly whetted, shields patched and hastily strengthened, and torches bound with pitch to hold back the night below. Gandalf himself was clad now not only in his grey cloak, but in a surcoat of fine mail, wrought in the elven lands of the west long ago, its bright links catching what little light there was, and reflecting it like a net of stars. In his hand he held Glamring, the foe hammer of Gondolin, and at his side hung a pouch filled with strange powders and herbs, tools of ancient craft and deeper power than the simple arts of war. His staff he bore still, and it shone now with a steady white radiance, though the light seemed somehow swallowed at its edges by the gloom that pressed down upon them all. They moved in silence, saved for the soft clatter of arms and the low murmur of Gandalf's voice as he sang under his breath songs of warding and of courage. Down they went from the bridge across the blackened riverbed where the stones were slick and treacherous, and into the great wound in the earth where once the river had run deep and full. The air grew colder as they descended, and the stench of decay and foulness rose up to meet them, a reek that spoke of long-forgotten death and things that had dwelt too long in darkness. At the base of the hollow they came upon the ruins of the old river, a place where once, it was said, the elves had tended the sacred waters in the days before men had come into the land. The stones were worn and broken, and the carvings upon them of flowing water, of stars and of lies blooming by starlight, were marred and twisted by the slow, corrupting breath of evil. Here Gandalf halted, and with a sweep of his staff he traced a circle upon the ground, scattering fine silver dust that caught the light and shimmered as though each grain were a tiny sun. "This is the place," he said, his voice deep and resonant, carrying to every ear, though he spoke no louder than a man would speak to his dearest friend. Here the binding must be wrought. While I weave the spell, you must stand guard, each at your appointed place, and let no creature, no shadow, no whisper pass beyond the circle's edge. For if the circle is broken, even by so much as a finger's breadth, the binding will fail, and Gulroth shall rise in his full strength. They took their places without hesitation, each at a point of the circle, torches held high and weapons ready. Their faces were pale, but their eyes shone with a light that no fear could dim. Gandalf knelt within the circle, setting before him a small basin of polished silver, filled with water taken from the last pure spring above the river's fall. Into this he cast herbs that smoked with a sweet and pungent scent. And as the smoke rose, it twined about him like a living thing, wrapping him in tendrils of shimmering gray. Then he began to chant, his voice rising and falling in a language older than the hills, a tongue in which the stars themselves had once been named. The sound of it stirred the very stones beneath their feet, and from the dark mouths of the caves beyond, there came a low, answering rumble, as though some vast beast stirred in restless dreaming. The defenders stood fast, hearts pounding, every sense strained to the utmost. Out of the deep blackness beyond the ruins, shapes began to stir, things that crept and slithered, half-seen, their eyes gleaming like coals in the murk. The torches cast wide circles of light, but beyond them the dark pressed close and thick, alive with unseen menace. Selwin gripped his sword tighter, his mouth dry, but he did not flinch. He thought of his home, of the laughter of his sisters, of the smell of fresh bread baking in the hearth, and he set his heart like stone against the fear that gnawed at its edges. Without warning, the first of the creatures leapt from the shadows. A twisted thing like a great spider, but with the face of a man twisted into a rectus of hate. Elrich met it with a roar, his hammer crushing it to the ground before it could cross the circle. Then came more black shapes with grasping claws and fangs dripping venom, born of the dark dreams of Gulroth, each more foul than the last. They hurled themselves against the defenders, shrieking and gibbering, and the air was filled with the clash of arms and the stench of blood and smoke. Time seemed to lose all meaning. Gandalf's voice rose higher, a beacon of sound against the howling dark, and the defenders fought as men in a dream. Each blow and parry a thing of instinct and desperate need. Torches flared and sputtered, casting leaping shadows upon the broken stones, and the ground grew slick with black ochre. Again and again the creatures threw themselves at the circle, and each time they were hurled back by blade and flame. But the defenders were growing weary, and their strength, great though it was, could not last forever. Selwyn stumbled as a great bat-winged thing swooped down upon him, its claws raking his shield, but he drove his sword into its breast and cast it writhing to the earth. Beside him, Hara loosed arrow after arrow, her face set and pale, as she drove back a tide of creeping, crawling horrors. Still Gandalf sang, his voice now a bright, unbreakable thread in the heart of the storm. The silver basin before him shone with an inner light, and the smoke that wafted him thickened, shaping itself into forms of stars and flowing waters that danced and twisted in the air. Sweat poured from his brow, and his hands trembled with the stand. At last, from the darkness beyond the ruins, there came a roar that shook the very ground, and a shape vast and terrible loomed into sight. A thing of black water and bone, its eyes twin pits of malice, its body ever shifting as though it were made of the river itself, twisted by hate. Gulroth had come. The defenders quailed before its might, for it towered above them like a mountain born of nightmare, and its very presence filled the air with a crushing weight of despair. But though their hearts faltered, their feet did not, and they stood their ground, torches blazing and blades ready. Gandalf rose to his full height within the circle, glamoring, burning with a cold white flame in his hand. His chant rose to a mighty crescendo, and the light from the basin surged outward, forming a dome of brilliance that drove back the darkness, even as Gulroth hurled itself forward in a fury of writhing blackness. The final battle had begun. The roar of Gulroth shook the ruins to their foundations, and the defenders staggered beneath the blast of fetid wind that issued from its gaping maw. Like a tide of despair, its presence pressed upon them, bending their wills as a storm bends the tallest trees. Many cried out in terror, and even the bravest among them felt the heavy hand of dread upon their hearts. Yet none fled, for Gandalf's voice, strong and pure as the song of the firstborn stars, rose ever higher, weaving a shield of sound and light about the circle where he stood. The creature surged forward, a mass of writhing darkness and black water, flinging aside the broken stones as though they were but pebbles. Its limbs, if limbs they could be called, lashed out in fury, striking at the defenders with the strength of a crashing flood. Hara was hurled from her feet by the blow of a shadowy tendril. Yet she rose again, blood streaming from her brow, and loosed a shaft straight into the heart of the darkness. It passed through without harm, swallowed up by the formless body of the beast. But her defiance kindled a spark among the others, reminding them that even the smallest light may defy the deepest dark. Selwin stood firm at the forefront, his shield arm numbed from the force of the blows. He turned aside. His sword gleamed with the faint light of the torches, and with every stroke he drove back the lesser spawn that scuttled before Gulroth like vermin before a lord of filth. Beside him fought Elrich, his hammer rising and falling in steady rhythm, each blow cracking bone and rending flesh, though the enemies seemed endless and ever-renewing. Still Gandalf sang, and the power of his song grew terrible, a trembling force that made the stones shudder and the black waters recoil. Upon the surface of the silver basin, images flickered and danced, stars wheeling in the heavens, rivers flowing pure and free, lies blooming upon silver pools sought to unmake and devour. And for a moment, it seemed to the defenders that the light must surely prevail. But Gulroth was no simple foe, no mere beast of fang and claw. It was a spirit of hatred and hunger, born in the elder dark before the sun had risen, and it gathered itself now for a blow that would shatter the very earth beneath their feet. With a scream that split the sky, it hurled itself against the circle, striking with all the weight of the deep waters and the ancient malice of forgotten ages. The shock of the impact flung the defenders backward, torches sputtering and dying, shields torn from arms, and weapons sense spinning into the shadows. The circle of light faltered, wavering like a candle in a gale, and Gandalf staggered, his chant faltering for a heartbeat that seemed to stretch into eternity. In that moment, the darkness pressed inward, a wall of blackness, seeking to drown the light and break the bindings that held it at bay. The defenders struggled to their feet, battered and bruised, their weapons lost or broken. Yet they closed ranks once more, forming a living wall before Gandalf, each willing to spend their last breath to protect the wizard and the hope he carried. Selwin, dazed and bleeding from a gash upon his temple, seized a fallen torch and thrust it high, its flickering flame a beacon against the creeping night. He stood alone at the breach where the circle had been torn, his body a frail bulwark against the surging dark, and with a cry that was part defiance, part prayer, he drove the torch into the sting mass of Gulroth. The creature recoiled, shrieking in a voice that echoed with the agony of 1,000 lost souls. Where the flame touched, its form shrank and withered, black waters hissing into steam, shadows curling inward upon themselves. Gandalf seized the moment, his voice rising once more in a chant that burned with the fire of the Valor themselves. And from the basin leapt a great light, pure and unbreakable, that swept outward in a wave of searing brilliance. The light struck Gulroth full upon its writhing form, and the creature screamed, a sound of such fury and despair that the very stars seemed to tremble in their courses. It thrashed and writhed, seeking to flee, to burrow once more into the secret deeps. But the light held it fast, burning away the lies and hungers that clothed it. The ground shook violently, and the ruins began to collapse inward, stones falling like rain, the very riverbed crumbling beneath their feet. Gandalf, with a final cry of command, flung his staff into the basin, and the silver water erupted upward in a pillar of flame and starlight, engulfing Gulroth and casting its broken form back into the chasms from which it had come. Then there was silence, a silence so deep and vast that it seemed the world itself had paused to breathe again after the long nightmare. Gandalf sank to his knees, his strength spent, and the defenders, battered and bloodied, gathered around him, scarcely daring to believe that they yet lived. The circle of light faded slowly, leaving behind only the pale glow of the wounded sun above and the stench of burnt stone and foulness rising from the shattered earth. Selwin knelt beside the wizard, his torch guttering in the ruinous air. "Is it over?" he asked, his voice a threadbare whisper, and opened his eyes, and though weariness lay heavy upon him, there was a light there that no darkness could extinguish. "For now," he said, his voice low but sure, "the shadow is bound once more, and Lanthier's ford is safe." At those words, a great weight lifted from the hearts of all who heard, and they wept, not with sorrow, but with a fierce, wild joy, as prisoners might weep upon seeing the first light of dawn after a long captivity. They embraced one another, laughing and crying by turns, and even Gandalf smiled, though his face was lined with deep weariness. The ruins of the river lay broken and silent around them, the ground scarred and blackened. Yet already the first stirrings of life could be felt. The whisper of water trickling through new-formed rills, the faint scent of clean earth rising through the smoke. Hope, fragile and battered, had not been extinguished. Thus ended the Battle of the Dark Waters, and though it would be many years before the river Gelion ran full and strong once more, the people of Lanthier's ford had won a victory that would be sung of in the ages to come. A victory not of great armies or mighty lords, but of simple folk who dared to stand against the darkness when all else had fled. The days that followed the defeat of Gulroth were filled with a strange and quiet labor, touched alike by sorrow and by joy. The people of Lanthier's ford, weary though they were, set themselves to the task of mending what had been broken. The riverbed, scarred by fire and upheaval, lay silent and wounded. Yet small springs, pure and sweet, began to rise from hidden places in the earth. And the people, guided by Gandalf's wisdom, worked to guide their flow, to heal the land that had nearly been lost to darkness. It was no easy work, for the wounds of that terrible night ran deep, both in stone and in spirit. Many were the homes that had been torn or blackened by the battle, and many a field lay trampled and fouled. Yet the folk of Lanthier's Ford were a hardy breed, and though their hands ached and their hearts carried the heavy burden of memory, they labored without ceasing. For they knew now, with bitter certainty, how dearly the light must be defended. Gandalf remained among them for a time, lending his strength where he could, and guiding the healing of the land with words of old power. He was often seen walking alone upon the banks of the river at dusk, his gray cloak fluttering in the evening breeze, his head bowed in thought. Many wondered what burdens weighed upon him, but none dared disturb his solitude, for in those moments he seemed as one who gazed beyond the world of mortal men into deeper and older things. Selwin, though his wounds were many, took up a new place among the people, for the deeds of that night had marked him as a leader. His voice, once little heeded in council, now carried weight, and his heart, tempered by battle and grief, bore a wisdom beyond his years. Often he would sit with the children of the village, telling them of the stars and of the rivers, teaching them to remember not only the horrors they had faced, but the beauty that was yet to be cherished and defended. Elrich, whose hammer had broken the limbs of many dark things, returned to the forge of his father, where he reforged the broken blades and tools of the village, singing as he worked songs of old battles and brighter days to come. And Hara, keen-eyed and swift, led the hunters into the wilds, seeking out the last remnants of the darkness that had fled before Gandalf's light, lest any seed of evil should be left to grow anew. As the days passed and the river grew clearer and stronger, a change came over Lanthier's Ford. No longer did fear haunt the hearts of its people, nor did despair darken their dreams. They had seen the shadow had stood against it, and in that standing they had found a strength deeper than any they had known. Their songs, once soft and wistful, now rang bold and bright through the fields and along the riverbanks, and their laughter carried upon the wind, mingling with the song of the water. Yet Gandalf knew that his time among them must soon end, for the road stretched ever onward before him, and the world beyond Lanthier's Ford stirred with troubles yet greater than those faced beneath the dark waters. On a morning wrapped in golden mist, when the sun was but a pale disk above the eastern hills, he gathered the people before the longhouse, and there he spoke to them for the last time. "You have done deeds that shall be remembered in the songs of the wise," he said. And his voice, though weary, held a pride deep and true. "You stood against the darkness, not with swords of great renown or shields borne by kings, but with the courage of your hearts and the steadfastness of your spirits. Such strength is rarer than the gold of the dwarves or the wisdom of the elves, and it shall endure long after towers have crumbled and kingdoms have fallen into death." Then he turned to Selwin and laid a hand upon his shoulder, and the young man felt a warmth pass into him, a blessing of courage and hope that would not fade with the years. "Guard this place well," Gandalf said, "for though the great shadows of the world may pass far from your borders, darkness is ever watchful, and it is in the quiet places that the first seeds of evil often take root. Teach your children to love the light, to cherish the beauty of the world, and to stand against despair, and you shall leave a legacy brighter than any king's crown." With those words he turned from them, and leaning upon his staff he walked out from Lanthier's Ford, his figure soon lost amid the golden mist. Many stood long upon the road, gazing after him, until the last glimmer of his gray cloak was swallowed by the hills. Thus Gandalf departed as he had come, a wanderer upon the wild roads of the world, bearing news and hope, sorrow and wisdom wherever they were needed. And though the people of Lanthier's Ford saw him no more, the memory of his coming remained. A light kindled in their hearts that no shadow could extinguish. Seasons passed, and the river Gelion, fed by the hidden springs, grew broad and strong once more, singing a song of life and renewal. The fields blossomed anew, and the children grew tall and bold, their laughter a living testament to the courage of those who had stood upon the stone bridge in the hour of deepest peril. And so, beneath the wide sky of Middle East, amid the whispering reeds in the golden fields of Lanthier's Ford, the story of the Battle of the Dark Waters lived on. A tale of hope and of defiance carried upon the wind to the furthest corners of the world. In the years that followed the Battle of the Dark Waters, Lanthier's Fort grew into a place of quiet strength and hidden renown. Though it was never marked upon the grand maps of kings or written of in the histories of great cities, yet among the free peoples of Eriador, from the wandering rangers to the wandering dwarves who pied the old East Road, tales of the stone bridge and its defenders were spoken with respect, and oftentimes with a wonder that such valor had arisen among folk so humble. Travelers who crossed the bridge in later days, whether merchant, minstrel, or soldier, would feel a stirring in their hearts, as though some ancient blessing still clung to the stones, whispering of a battle fought not for conquest or glory, but for the simple right to live free under the open sky. The fields that had been blackened by fire grew green again, and the vineyards upon the hillsides bore sweeter fruit than ever before, as if the earth itself sought to reward the courage of those who had saved it from corruption. The river Gelion, though it would never again flow as wide and mighty as in the elder days, ran bright and swift once more, and its waters sang of healing and renewal, a song that carried even to the distant woods in the lonely hill. Selwin, whose sword had been the first to answer Gandalf's call, was chosen by the people to lead them, not as a lord draped in fine raiment and crowned with gold, but as a chieftain who bore no title greater than that of Warden of the Ford. He ruled not by decree or force, but by counsel, and by the strength of the love the people bore him. For he had fought beside them and bled for their homes, and they would follow none other. In the council hall, where once fear had reigned, there were now songs and laughter, and at every feast a place was left empty at the high table, in honor of the great pilgrim who had come among them in their hour of need, and departed before the first songs of victory had been sung. Elrich, the smith's son, rebuilt the old forge that had been half ruined in the night of fire and battle. From that place he wrought not only plowshares and horseshoes, but blades and buckles of rare strength and beauty, forged with the memory of darkness and the light that had overcome it. It was said by some that the weapons he forged bore a blessing against shadow, for none who carried them into battle would ever flee before the enemy, and many a wandering knight or ranger would make the long journey to Lanthier's Ford to seek the work of Elrich's hand. As for Hara, she led the hunters far into the wilds beyond the river's reach, keeping watch over the borders of their land. Her keen eyes saw signs that others would have missed: the faint print of a goblin's foot, the broken twig that spoke of unseen movement. And more than once her warning cry saved the village from raiders and beasts that might otherwise have wrought ruin. Though she laughed little and often sat alone by the fire, there was a warmth in her heart that none could doubt, and the children of the village would follow her on her rounds, learning from her the ways of the woods and the secret paths of the hills. Yet even in peace, the memory of what had been endured was not forgotten. Upon the highest point of the stone bridge, where Gandalf had stood in the hour of the great assault, the people raised a ka of white stones, each carried by hand from the fields and hills about, and upon it they set a simple plaque of bronze, engraved with words that Selwin himself had spoken. In the darkest hour, the light endured. There was no need to name the battle, nor the enemy, nor the heroes who had stood against it. For all who lived in Lanthier's ford knew the tale, and they taught it to their children and their children's children, so that the courage of that night would not be forgotten, even when all other memories had faded. And still, at times when the river mist rose thick upon the fields, and the reeds whispered in the twilight breeze, the people would say that they saw a figure in gray standing upon the bridge, leaning on a staff that shone faintly with its own light. Some said it was but a trick of the mist, or the longing of hearts that remembered the gray wanderer's coming. Yet those who had known Gandalf in truth, who had seen the fire in his eyes and heard the music of his voice, believed otherwise. They believed that he returned unseen to watch over them in the quiet hours of the night, guarding the bridge and the river and the land he had helped to save. So the seasons turned, and the world outside Lanthier's ford grew ever darker as whispers of war and shadow came out of the east and the south, rumors carried by weary travelers and broken soldiers. Great kings rose and fell, cities were besieged, and kingdoms laid waste. And the great and terrible war that would one day be called the War of the Ring stirred faintly in the dreams of men and elves and dwarves alike. Yet Lanthier's ford endured a small bright flame against the coming storm, a place where the memory of courage and sacrifice still lived, and where the light was cherished above all other treasures. For it had been bought dearly, and those who had paid the price had not paid it in vain. And so it was that in the hidden corners of Middle-earth, where the great powers seldom trod, the spirit of resistance, of hope, and of quiet heroism endured, woven into the fabric of the world like threads of silver and gold, unseen by most, but unbreakable and more precious than the crowns of kings. Thus the tale of Gandalf and the Battle of the Dark Waters passed into legend among the simple folk of Lanthier's ford, and it remained a beacon for those who would come after. A reminder that even the smallest hands, if guided by courage and steadfastness, could hold the fate of the world within their grasp. As the years drew onward and the shadow that brooded in the east grew bolder, Lanthier's ford remained as it had always been, a place of quiet courage and simple joy. Yet beneath the calm surface, the memory of the dark waters lingered, like an old scar upon the land, not aching with every passing day, but never wholly forgotten. Selwin grew into a man of great wisdom and temperate counsel, and though the golden hue of his hair silvered with the passing of time, the fire that Gandalf had kindled in him did not dim, and strangers passed through the village. Weary and bowed by the hardships of the wider world, he welcomed them with fair words and honest hospitality. But ever his keen gaze weighed them as a master mason tests each stone, seeking cracks and hidden flaws. Elrich's fame spread further than any among his folk would have thought possible, for blades and mail from his forge found their way into the hands of the wandering rangers who kept the wild places, and into the strongholds of hidden kings who ruled not by open banners, but by secret strength. It was whispered even among the wise that one of his blades found its way into the north to the hand of a chieftain of the Dunedain, though the tale was never confirmed, and Elrich himself would only smile and turn back to his anvil when asked. Hara's name too became one of quiet renown, for under her watchful eye, Lanthier's ford remained untouched by the creeping fingers of the darkness that spread elsewhere. Many times she would disappear into the hills for days without word, returning with tidings of things unseen by others. A party of goblins moving stealthily through the woods, a war spore in the marshes, or the flicker of firelight from some hidden encampment of unsavory men. Through her vigilance, danger was turned aside time and again, and those who lived within sight of the stone bridge learned to sleep in peace, knowing that the hills had eyes friendly to them. Though the world beyond changed, and dark news spread like a cold wind through the lands of Eriador, within the bounds of Lanthier's Ford, life remained steadfast, rooted in traditions both old and new. The Festival of the River's Return was celebrated each year when the waters of Gelion, fed by rain and spring, rose high and strong once more. On that day, garlands of blue flowers were woven and cast into the river, and songs were sung upon the stone bridge. Songs of gratitude and remembrance for those who had fought and bled to preserve the light. Among the children born after the great battle, the stories of Gandalf and the Battle of the Dark Waters were more than mere tales to hasten sleep. They were part of the living fabric of their world. By firelight and under the boughs of the old willow tree by the riverbank, they listened wide-eyed to the recounting of that terrible night. The roar of the drums, the charge of the orcs, the shining of Gandalf's staff, and the final blinding light that had cast down the ancient evil. Selwin himself would sometimes sit with them, his voice low and measured, recounting not only the glories, but the fears, the doubts, the pain of loss, teaching them that true courage is not the absence of fear, but the mastery of it, and that the smallest act of hope could shine brighter than the greatest sword. Thus the spirit of Lanthier's Ford endured, rooted not in pride or arrogance, but in humility, gratitude, and the quiet knowledge that light once defended with such cost must be tended always with care and vigilance. It was in the 20th year after the Battle of the Dark Waters, in the spring when the fields were green and heavy with new growth, that a strange company came to Lanthier's Ford. They were few in number, cloaked and hooded, their faces shadowed and their words few. But there was a grace in their bearing and a weight in their silence that marked them as no ordinary wanderers. At their head rode a tall figure clad in gray, whose presence stirred an echo deep in the hearts of those who remembered. Selwin, standing upon the stone bridge to greet them, felt a stirring in his soul, as though a door long closed had been opened once more. When the figure drew near and cast back his hood, the villagers gasped. For though time seemed to have weighed little upon him, and his eyes yet shone with that same fire, it was Gandalf the Grey who had returned. He smiled, a weary but warm smile, and greeted Selwin by name, his voice no less bright than when it had first kindled hope in that dark hour long ago. And though he spoke little of his journeys or the heavy burdens that lay upon him, he stayed for a time among the folk he had once saved, resting and remembering, as one might return to an old and beloved home before venturing once more into storm and peril. During his day, Gandalf would walk often by the riverbank, his hand lightly touching the stones of the bridge, as if in silent conversation with the memory of that night. Sometimes he would sit by the Ka upon the bridge's crown, his staff laid across his knees, his gaze far away, and those who passed him by would see a sadness in his eyes, a sorrow not for Lanthier's Ford, but for the wider world whose trials were yet un. For even as peace held in that small corner of Middle-earth, Gandalf knew, as few others did, that a darkness greater than Gulroth was stirring once more, gathering its strength in secret places, preparing for a war that would rend the very bones of the world. Yet for that brief time he allowed himself the comfort of the light he had helped preserve and the company of those whose hearts still burned true. A light unquenched amidst the gathering gloom. When he departed once more, it was with no fanfare, no sound of horn or drum, but with the quiet dignity of one who carries the weight of many fates upon his shoulders. Selwin and the elders of the village watched him go, standing upon the bridge as he faded into the mist, and though none spoke, they knew in their hearts that they had been honored beyond words. Thus Gandalf passed from Lanthier's ford once more, leaving behind not grief, but gratitude, and a renewed strength to face whatever trials the world might yet bring. And the river sang on, and the children laughed in the fields, and the stone bridge stood firm against the passage of time, a silent guardian over a people who had dared to hope and had prevailed. As the world darkened and distant lands groaned under the weight of growing shadows, Lanthier's ford remained a quiet jewel among the fields of Ariador, a place where time moved more gently, and the burdens that crushed the kingdoms of men and the hidden realms of elves seemed for a while longer held at bay. Yet even here the winds of change could not be wholly turned aside, and whispers of great wars and terrible deeds reached their ears upon the mouths of weary travelers who spoke with guarded tongues of battles fought beyond the misty mountains, of towers besieged and kings fallen into despair. Selwin, grown gray and wise, would listen to these tidings with a heavy heart, knowing full well that the peace of Lanthier's ford was not born of isolation, but of a victory dearly purchased, and that one day perhaps the darkness would seek to test the strength of their walls once more. Yet he did not speak of these fears to his people, for he believed, as Gandalf had once taught him, that hope must be nurtured like a tender flame, guarded fiercely against the chill winds of despair. Thus the people lived, their hearts steadfast, and their days filled with the simple labors of sowing and reaping, of hunting and crafting, of song and of story. They told the tale of the battle of the dark waters by hearth and by field, passing it from lips wrinkled with age to ears fresh and wide with wonder, weaving it into their festivals and their prayers, so that even the youngest child could speak the names of those who had stood upon the stone bridge when all seemed lost. The river Gelion, though it had shrunk from its ancient might, ran swift and clear once more, and in its singing waters could be heard, if one listened with a heart open to memory, the faint echoes of the songs that Gandalf had woven upon the ruined stones, songs that had bound the darkness and sealed the fate of the shadow-haunted caves. The reeds swayed upon its banks, and the fish leapt in its depths, and the willows whispered of old battles and undying courage. In time, Elrich laid down his hammer, his great shoulders bowed, not by defeat, but by the simple weariness of a life spent in labor and service. His son, taught in the secret arts of forging and crafting that Elrich had learned in part from Gandalf's own teachings, took up the hammer in his stead, and the forge fire never died, a bright beacon against the coming night. And Hara, who had once watched over the borders with arrow and keen eye, passed her knowledge to a new generation of hunters, so that even as her steps grew slower and her hair turned silver, the wild places around Lanthier's ford remained guarded by those who knew the signs of danger and the ways of hidden paths. Thus the circle of life and memory turned, weaving a tapestry of quiet heroism that clothed the land in strength invisible to the eye, yet stronger by far than walls of stone or towers of iron. Yet not all memories were sweet, For in dreams and in the silent hours before dawn, there would come to some among them visions of the battle, the drums in the dark, the seething flood of orcs, the towering shadow of Gulroth. Though the creature had been bound and driven back into the deep places of the earth, its memory lingered, a reminder that darkness is never wholly destroyed, only beaten back for a time, awaiting its hour. It was said by the wise that in every place where great evil had been fought and conquered, a seed of that evil remained, buried deep in the bones of the earth, and that vigilance was the price of peace. Thus it was in Lanthier's ford, where the people kept watch, not with fear, but with the quiet understanding that light must be tended and renewed with every passing year. And sometimes, when the mists rolled thick along the river at sunset, old Selwin would stand alone upon the stone bridge, his hand resting lightly upon the smooth stones, and he would remember the night when the darkness came and was turned aside by the hands and hearts of simple folk. He would remember Gandalf standing tall with his staff blazing like a star, and he would whisper a prayer into the evening wind, a prayer not for himself, but for all the world beyond their borders, where the same struggle played out on grander and more terrible fields. For he knew, as Gandalf had known, that the battle against the shadow was a battle without end, fought in every heart, in every choice between hope and despair, between courage and surrender. And though the great wars might rage far beyond Lanthier's ford, each small victory of light over dark, each simple act of defiance against fear, was a stone laid in the foundation of the world's renewal. Thus, the spirit of Lanthier's ford became a living thing, passed on like a secret fire from generation to generation, unseen by the world at large, yet vital to its survival. In the great cities, in the halls of kings, and the towers of wizards, few spoke of Lanthier's ford, and fewer still knew the deeds that had been wrought there. But in the hidden hearts of the wise, and among those who truly understood the nature of strength, the name of the stone bridge in the Battle of the Dark Waters was remembered, honored as a bright thread in the vast woven tapestry of Middle-earth. And so the seasons turned, the river flowed, and life endured as it always has and must. When the light is held dear, and the darkness, though it may rage, finds no foothold in the hearts of the free. Years pass, as they ever do in Middle-earth, slow and sure like the winding of a great and ancient clock, whose hands none could hasten nor delay. In length years forward, the river grew ever stronger. The fields flourished beneath the sun in the soft rains, and the children of those who had fought at the stone bridge grew into men and women stout of heart and keen of spirit. Yet even as peace held sway within that sheltered fold of the world, the winds beyond carried darker tidings, and there were some among the older folk who would turn their gaze to the east at twilight, their hearts heavy with unease. Selwin, now an old man, his back slightly bowed, but his gaze still sharp, would sit before the longhouse and speak with the young, passing on what wisdom he could. He spoke not only of courage in battle, for such moments, though glorious, were rare and fleeting. Rather, he taught them of the courage to endure through quiet days, to hold fast to kindness and to hope. Even when the world grew gray and harsh, he taught them that victory was not always won by sword or shield, but by the steadfast beating of a faithful heart against the gathering dark. In those days there came to Lanthier's ford a few strange visitors, men of distant lands, bearing the marks of long travels and harder battles. And in their weary eyes was written the story of the great wars that raged far to the south and east. They would tarry for a night or two, sharing what news they could offer, of a dark lord rising once more, of kingdoms besieged, of brave deeds done in secret and sacrifices made beneath blackened sky. And though they marveled at the peace and green beauty of Lanthier's Ford, none stayed long. For the road called them onwards, as it always does, to those who have taken up the burden of the wide world. Once in the late days of autumn, when the golden leaves lay thick upon the riverbank, an elf came to the stone bridge. His raiment was of gray and green, and he bore upon his brow a circlet of silver wrought in the likeness of intertwining leaves. His coming was silent as the falling of mist, and his eyes held the depth of ages beyond the ken of mortal men. He spoke little, but to Selwin he revealed his name, Elrich, son of Eland of Rivendell. He tried for a day and a night, speaking with Selwin beneath the whispering willows and walking along the banks of the Gelion, as if listening to the song of the waters of the world beyond. He spoke with sorrow, for the shadow had grown terrible and strong, and the free peoples of Middle-earth stood upon the brink of a doom whose outcome was hidden even from the wise. Yet when he departed, he left behind a gift, a small stone clear as crystal, set upon a chain of silver. To Selwin, he said, "This is the Eldral, the star-glass, blessed by the Lady of Rivendell. Keep it near, for though the darkness may rise, the light of the stars endures, and hope is never wholly extinguished." Someone placed the star-glass within the longhouse, where it hung above the hearth, casting its gentle radiance over the gatherings of the people, a sign and a reminder that even in the deepest night, the stars would still sing in the high heavens. Thus the days wore on, golden and bitter by turns, and though tales of war and ruin continued to reach Lanthier's Ford, no army ever crossed their fields, no dark banners ever cast a shadow upon their bridge. Whether by the hand of fate or by the unseen protection of those powers that watched from beyond the circles of the world, the small settlement endured, a green and shining jewel preserved against the ruin of time. Yet Selwin, wise beyond the measure of his years, knew that peace is never won once and for all, but must be guarded and renewed with every generation. And so he instructed the young to learn the songs of old, to keep alive the memory of the Battle of the Dark Waters, to honor the courage of those who had fought before them, and to be ready should the day ever come when darkness crept again across the fields and the river's song faltered. In the spring of his 95th year, Selwyn passed from the world of men, not in battle, nor in bitterness, but quietly, as a river slips into the sea, his hand resting upon the stones of the bridge he had sworn to protect. The people mourned him with deep and lasting sorrow, for he had been more than a leader. He had been the heart of Lanthier's Ford, the living memory of all that had been fought for. And one off for the bridge, they raised another stone beside the first, plain and unadorned, bearing only these words: Selwyn, Warden of the Stone Bridge, Keeper of the Light. There was no need for more, for all who crossed the bridge from that day until the end of the age could feel the spirit of the place, could hear in the whisper of the river and the sigh of the reeds the echo of a steadfast heart that had held back the darkness. And the star-glass shone on, undemeaned. Thus the legacy of Gandalf's coming in and the courage of the folk of Lanthier's Ford was preserved, not in grand tomes or in the annals of kings, but in the living hearts of those who remembered and honored the light even as the great tides of history surged and receded far beyond their quiet fields. For in Middle-earth, it is not always the proud and mighty who shape the fate of the world, but often the humble and the forgotten. who by their steadfastness and love of the good and the simple hold the line against despair and keep alive the flame of hope when all else seems lost. And so it was in Lanthier's Ford until the end of the Third Age and beyond. In the long years that followed, as the world changed and the Third Age passed into the songs and memories of the wise, the name of Lanthier's Ford faded from the knowledge of kings and lords, and the maps of men grew heavy with the names of other places, of newer cities and greater battles. Yet among the simple folk who tilled the earth and fished the river, the memory endured, not as a boastful tale, but as a quiet truth woven into the fabric of their lives, as surely as the stones of the stone bridge lay woven into the river's path. The descendants of Selwin and Elrich and Hara lived and died beneath the watchful gaze of the stars and the steady song of the Gelion. They taught their children to respect the river, to honor the bridge, and to gather each spring beneath the Chiron, to lay down garlands of lies and sing the old songs. They told by firelight the story of how when the riverbed lay cracked and blackened, and the stars hid their faces in fear, the people of Lanthier's Ford had stood against a darkness that sought to devour not only their homes, but the very light from their lives. So too did they remember Gandalf the Grey, though few now knew from whence he had truly come, or what greater purposes had driven him to their aid. To them he was as a figure from legend, a bringer of fire and wisdom, who had passed through their lives as swiftly and mysteriously as the falling of a star. No, his name was spoken less often with each passing generation. The virtues he had kindled, courage, humility, steadfastness, remained living on in the hearts of the folk of Lanthier's Ford. The star-glass, the elder remained ever bright above the hearth in the long house. And though the storms of the world battered against the hills, and the tides of time wore down even the mountains, its light never faltered. It shone through the gray mists of sorrow, through the heavy rains of loss, through the quiet winters of weariness, a small but unyielding flame, much like the hearts of those who had borne it. There came a time, long after the passing of the ring into fire and the sailing of the elves into the west, when a wanderer from distant lands, a man cloaked in green and gray, with a face weathered by many years of road and war, came upon the stone bridge. He paused, gazing with wonder at the ancient Ka and the two stones set atop it, their inscriptions weathered but still legible to one who had the patience to look closely. He crossed the bridge slowly, feeling beneath his feet the smooth stones worn by countless generations. And on the far side he stood a long time listening to the river's song. And though he had walked in many lands and heard the voices of many rivers, it seemed to him that this river sang a song of hope woven with sorrow, yet stronger than either. A song that spoke not of mighty battles or crowns won and lost, but of a steadfastness that neither war nor time could unmake. When he spoke at last, it was with a voice softened by awe. Here was light preserved, though the world darkened. Here the free hearts of Middle-earth stood, though no banners flew above them, and no songs were sung in their honor beyond these fields. And so he stayed for a time among the folk of Lanthier's Fort, learning their ways and hearing from their lips the stories that lived in their blood. When he departed, he bore with him a memory bright and pure, and in distant halls and among hidden gatherings he would tell of the stone bridge and the battle of the dark waters, ensuring that though the river might forget, though the hills might crumble, the story would live on in the hearts of those who yet cherish the light. Thus it was that a small settlement by a forgotten river, guarded by no walls, defended by no armies, passed into the true lore of Middle-earth, a hidden, shining gem polished by courage and remembrance, lying quietly amid the gathering twilight of the world. And though the names might fade from the tongues of men, and though the stones themselves might one day sink into the river's bed, yet the spirit of Lanthier's ford would endure. It would endure in every act of courage unseen, in every kindness offered without hope of reward, in every choice to stand, however hopeless the odds, against the creeping dark. For as Gandalf himself had once known, and as the people of Lanthier's Ford had lived, the true power of the world was not in the thrones of kings, nor in the vaults of the mighty, but in the hearts of those who, in the darkest hour, yet dared to kindle a light. That light, though flickering and frail,